The water at the Poplar Ford was colder than it had any right to be. Morning light slid down the low hills and caught on the surface of the river, turning the ripples into hammered silver. The flat stepping stones, laid like uneven stairs across the shallow stretch, were slick with moss and the memory of light. A thin mist hovered just above the water, lifting slowly as if it, too, were reluctant to leave. I had my feet in again before anyone could protest. My walker stood just behind me on the bank, and Pearl lay beside it like a small house hippo sentinel, chin on paws, watching everything with solemn intensity. Agnes, on the other hand, was not solemn. She was nosing between two stones in the ford, sniffing with that long, flexible body of hers bent like a ribbon. Every few seconds she lifted her narrow face and blinked, as if personally offended that the river refused to reveal its secrets. Polecats are curious creatures. They investigate first and decide later whether something is safe. Agnes sniffed, pawed, then did something I'd never seen before. She flattened herself low and slid across one wet stone, belly first, as if testing its temperature with her entire body. Claire stood near her, serene as ever, skirts brushing the water's edge. Agnes believes, she said quietly to Lucia, who was watching with fascination, that if one becomes small enough, one may pass through many dangers unnoticed. Lucia's eyes widened. Like the Israelites crossing the Jordan? We had been discussing Joshua leading the people into the promised land. Claire's mouth curved. I'm not sure 2 million people crossing the Jordan with the waters miraculously piled up on one side were unnoticeable, and I don't think Agnes is considering salvation history. Agnes chose that moment to sneeze violently and scramble backward, having apparently encountered something disagreeable in a crevice. Pearl barked once, a short warning sound, then glanced at Claire as if to say, Your polecat is malfunctioning. Behind us, the desert father stood unmoving. His robes hung straight despite the slight breeze. His face looked carved from something older than the stone. Father, Liam asked carefully, did you learn anything in the desert about fear? The old man didn't answer at once. He watched the river as if it were speaking. In the desert, he said finally, fear is a teacher. It tells you where you are not yet dead to yourself. Sean raised an eyebrow. That's encouraging. The desert father's gaze flicked to him, sharp but not unkind. You want encouragement? Fear will not leave you because you wish it to. It leaves when it has finished its work. Dad stepped down onto one of the stones, testing it with his foot. And sometimes, he added, in his ordinary, steady way, fear isn't something you conquer. It's something you walk with because the path doesn't change. Mom took his hand before stepping beside him. And because you trust the one who told you to cross. Chet stood near the bank, backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked younger in the morning light, boyish almost, but there was a steadiness about him that didn't belong to youth. He bent and dipped his fingers into the water, then smiled faintly. Cold enough to wake a person up, he said. You'll need it, Sean replied. Terrain's supposed to get fussy. With David's help, I got up and reluctantly put my shoes back on. I was ready with my walker before the entire group was assembled. We crossed the stream one by one. David carried his pack like it was nothing. Francis walked lightly, bare feet finding their balance as if he'd known rivers all his life. Claire's hem darkened slightly, but she didn't seem to notice. Halfway across, Lucia paused on a stone and looked downstream. It's like we're stepping into something we can't even see the end of. Joshua. The name hovered without being spoken. Chet glanced at her. Gently, he told her, most callings are like that. When we reached the far bank, the path angled upward through scrub and low trees. The sky had cleared entirely. It was one of those deceptive mornings, bright, almost cheerful, but the land ahead grew rougher quickly. Rocks protruded at awkward angles, and narrow ledges skirted small drops. By morning, the river was a memory behind us. It was Liam who spotted the problem first. The path's gone. He wasn't exaggerating. A section of the trail had sheared away in what must have been a recent slide. The hillside had slumped, leaving a raw, crumbly face of dirt and stone about 15 feet wide. Beyond it, a shallow ravine dropped steeply enough to make a misstep unwise. David crouched and studied it. We can't go down and around easily. That'll cost hours. Sean tested the edge with his boot. A small cascade of pebbles slid away. Going across will require spacing, he said, one at a time. Agnes, delighted by the instability, darted ahead and scrambled halfway across before Claire could even call her name. Polecats are surprisingly agile climbers. Agnes's long body flexed and stretched, claws finding purchase where human boots hesitated. Pearl whined. She'll be fine, Clara murmured, though her eyes followed closely. The Desert Father stepped forward. He didn't look at the ravine. He looked at us. You may go back, he said simply. Fear will give you reasons. No one answered. Dad moved first. He didn't stride. He didn't dramatize. He simply placed one foot carefully in front of the other, arms slightly out for balance. Mom waited until he reached the other side before she followed, jaws set, eyes focused ahead. This reminded her of Cloud's Rest in Yosemite. Sean hovered near her without making a show of it, ready to grab her if needed. Dad turned as soon as he was across, hands lifted slightly, not grabbing, just present. One by one, we crossed. When it was Chet's turn, he adjusted his pack straps, as if tightening them gave him clarity. He stepped out onto the unstable earth and didn't rush. Halfway across, a small section shifted under his heel. He dropped to one knee instinctively, lowering his center of gravity, palms pressed into the dirt. Pebbles slid. He didn't swear. He didn't panic. He just waited. The slide stopped. He rose slowly and finished the crossing. On the far side, Lucia exhaled loudly. That felt like Joshua stepping into the Jordan. Chet smiled at her, except the water didn't part. Sometimes, Francis said gently, the water does not part. Sometimes you step in and discover it's shallower than you'd feared. It was my turn. The path looked narrower than it had for anyone else. It always does. David came toward me without a word. He didn't hover, didn't make a production of it. He just stood slightly downhill from me, close enough to steady, far enough to let me choose each step. Liam was already across and had turned back immediately. Aoife stood just before me, one hand lightly at my elbow, not gripping, just present. Sean got in front of me. We positioned the walker first. Sean tested the ground ahead with his boot, brushing away loose gravel. That stone's solid, he said quietly. Take your time. The wheels didn't smoothly roll on that unstable dirt, so I lifted and placed, inching forward. The earth shifted once under the left leg. My stomach dropped, but I didn't. I stopped. I waited. The small slide of pebbles ended as quickly as it had begun. Stay there, David said gently, not commanding, not alarmed, just steady. So I did. Then I moved again. When I finally stepped onto solid ground, Dad reached for my hand and squeezed it. Mom kissed my cheek. Sean pretended he hadn't been holding his breath. David touched my back comfortingly, and Aoife looked like she was going to cry in relief. She had crossed just behind me. I hadn't conquered anything. I had simply crossed, with a walker and a team of helpers. But sometimes crossing's enough, and I was becoming humble enough to accept help, as if I had any choice. Then I saw the Desert Father gazing at me pointedly. Okay, I always had a choice. We resumed walking, but the conversation shifted. It felt inevitable. Liam looked at Chet. You mentioned yesterday that there were demands. What exactly did they want? The air seemed to change slightly, not heavy, but more focused. Chet adjusted his pack again. He didn't dramatize his own story. He told it like someone explaining a weather report. They said they were M19, a terrorist group there in Colombia, he began. They accused SIL of being a front for the CIA, said our linguistic work was political espionage. Mom's brow furrowed. That must have felt surreal. It was, he admitted. We were teaching people to read their own language. That's not exactly covert operations. Dad nodded. Accusations like that are political currency. They don't need to be true. They need to be useful. They wrote to President Reagan. He had been inaugurated the day after they kidnapped me. Their demands were that SIL leave the country and that their manifesto be published in major American newspapers. If that didn't happen within a month, he paused, not for effect, but because the sentence didn't need embellishment. They said I'd be killed. Lucia's face went pale. Did you think they would? She asked quietly. Chet looked ahead at the narrowing trail. I thought it was possible. He glanced around at the rocky vista. I had also come to Bogota because I needed gallbladder surgery, so I was in enough pain to think I could die on my own. The desert father's voice cut in softly. And? And, Chet said, I asked myself whether my obedience was contingent on my safety. We walked in silence for a few steps. Dad cleared his throat. Mission agencies have policies about this. No negotiation with terrorists. It sounds harsh, but it protects the long view. If you negotiate once, you endanger everyone. Liam frowned. But that means, it means, Dad said gently, you can't make decisions driven by fear. Not as an individual, not as an organization. If fear dictates policy, you'll always be manipulated. Chet nodded. We knew that going in. We were all counseled on it before committing to the mission. We knew it was possible we'd be martyred. Plenty of missionaries have been. Mom squeezed his hand. They urged the captors not to shed blood, but they wouldn't abandon the work. Chet nodded. They opened their compound to journalists, invited them to search for evidence of CIA ties. There weren't any. And still? Sean asked. Still, Chet said, pressure mounted. Political pressure, media pressure, emotional pressure. The picture they sent, me surrounded by armed men, were meant to force reaction. They let me write a letter to my wife, Brenda, and another time they sent her my college ring as proof that they had me. What did you say to her? I asked, before I could command myself not to invade his privacy. My autism sometimes led me to be more straightforward than I should be. Fortunately, Chet didn't seem to mind. I reminded her of Paul and Silas in the Philippian prison. Agnes darted past at that moment, chasing something invisible to us. She bounded across a fallen log and froze, nose high, tail stiff. Pearl trotted after her, much less gracefully. Is she hunting? Aoife whispered. Always, Claire said. Polecats hunt by persistence. They investigate every crevice. Agnes dove into a hollow and emerged triumphantly, with nothing. She blinked as if offended that her victory had evaporated. Lucia laughed softly, tension easing. Sometimes, Chet said, watching Agnes, persistence looks foolish until it isn't. We rounded a bend where the path narrowed between two large rock outcroppings. The ground became uneven, angled slabs and jutting stone that required attention with each step. The split rock meadow should be just beyond this rise, David called from ahead. As we climbed, the conversation resumed, quieter now. Were you afraid? Liam asked. Chet didn't hesitate. Yes. There it was. No bravado. But fear didn't get to decide, he added. How? Lucia pressed. He thought for a moment. By remembering why I was there in the first place. Translation isn't just language, it's access. It's giving people the word in their own voice. If that work is from God, then my safety isn't the ultimate variable. Dad spoke again, almost to himself. Joshua stepped into territory he didn't conquer by strategy alone. Jericho came down through obedience and supernatural force. He stepped out because God said go. Francis turned, walking backward for a few steps, eyes bright. What would have happened if Joshua had said, "This looks dangerous. Let's renegotiate the promise"? He'd still be standing on the east side of the river, Sean muttered. Exactly, Francis said cheerfully. They'd probably have another 40 years in the desert, the father added cheerlessly. We reached the crest, and the land opened into a small meadow cupped between two great slabs of rock that split apart like a cracked loaf of bread. The grass was sparse but soft compared to the path. A thin stream threaded through the center, catching late afternoon light. the Split Rock Meadow. We spread out slowly, relief visible in shoulders and postures. Packs dropped. Pearl collapsed dramatically. Agnes began inspecting every hole in the rock face with intense professional focus. Lucia wandered toward the split in the rock and ran her fingers along the rough seam. It looks like something broke it open on purpose. Sometimes things split so life can pass through, Claire said quietly beside her. Lucia nodded slowly. Like the sea, or like pressure. Chet sat on a flat stone and removed his pack. He looked tired, but not in a defeated way, more like someone who had carried something meaningful. I've been thinking, Liam said, lowering himself onto the grass. I tend to back away when something gets politically complicated. I tell myself it's wisdom, but maybe sometimes it's just self-preservation. No one jumped to correct him. Dad sat nearby, elbows on knees. There's wisdom in prudence, but there's also wisdom in staying put when fear wants you to move. Mom brushed grass from her skirt and smiled at Liam. Discernment isn't always about escape. Sometimes it's about endurance. The desert father stood at the edge of the meadow, looking out over the split rock. In the desert, he said, you learn this. Demons shout. God commands quietly. If you are ruled by shouting, you will never obey the whisper. The meadow fell silent. The father added, you might not even hear it. Chet looked at the split rock and then at us. They wanted SIL to leave, he said, to abandon the work because of intimidation. But if the work is from God, leaving out of fear would have silenced more than one life. Lucia looked at him differently now, not as a story from history, but as a person sitting on a rock in front of her. And you stayed, she said. I was taken, he corrected gently, but the work stayed. That mattered more. The sun dipped lower, sliding between two halves of the rock and spilling light into the seam. Joshua, be strong and courageous. No one said it aloud, but we all knew. This is Chet's actual letter to his wife Brenda. I believe this is just part of it. The Lord brought 2 Corinthians 2:14 to mind. But thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumph through the Lord Jesus Christ. The word for triumph was used for the Roman victory parades when the soldiers were received back at home by the cheering crowds after a successful battle. I have had a lot of free time to think about such things as Daniel's 3 friends and Paul and Silas's experience in the jail at Philippi. In the case of Daniel's friends, God did something very unusual through his power for a specific purpose, so that through everything, all concerned would learn, have their misconceptions corrected about him. The result of the experience was that everyone learned who he was. Remember Paul and the Praetorian Guard? Keep this in your thoughts for me. Wouldn't it be neat if something special like this would happen?